A gute Woche. The Rebbe Zilgezinsen began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is the Shabbos before Yud Beis Tammuz. And based on what Chazal tell us, that Shabbos gives bracha to the entire week. Same applies this week, that the entire week gets its bracha from Shabbos, including the day of Yud Beis Tammuz as well. And the Rebbe went a step further and explained that Bechlal, every inyan has its shleimus, its completeness. When we say we give bracha to an inyan, the pshat is by giving bracha that we add above the shleimus, above the completeness which the inyan has in its own rights, and here we are adding something additional. That is the accomplishment of giving bracha into the week, and the same applies to the day of Yud Beis Tammuz in this week's particular case. And the Rebbe tied it in with the expression of lekatchila ariba, and explained as follows. The inyan of the shleimus of the thing, of the inyan, is its completeness. When an inyan receives bracha, we may apply the term ariba. In other words, it is going above what this inyan stands for. We are giving additional koiches to the thing. Now that we are saying that on Shabbos we are adding this bracha, in other words, we are giving this bracha before we even come to this inyan. So this this corresponds to the thought of lekatchila ariba, lekatchila, right beforehand. In other words, on Shabbos, before we even reach to this day, we are putting this day of Yud Beis Tammuz in an oifm of ariba. And this expression of lekatchila ariba, we all know, is a famous quotation from the Rebbe Maharash. The Rebbe Maharash was the grandfather of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Bechlal, Svarim tell us, Teferes keinim b'nei banim, it's a pasuk, which means that the beauty of elders is when they reach to Einiklach. And the Frierdiker Rebbe was a grandson of the Rebbe Maharash, but more particular, the Frierdiker Rebbe had a strong resemblance on his face to the Rebbe Maharash. Rebbe says it's known people who saw the Frierdiker Rebbe the first time, and we're talking about people who knew the Rebbe Maharash, expressed themselves that the Frierdiker Rebbe looks very similar to the Rebbe Maharash. So this is to be mechazik, to strengthen this thought, how the shaykhs of lekatchila ariba has a shaykhs to the inyan of Yud Beis Tammuz, which is the Yom Chag Agula of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The reason for today's Farbrengen, the Rebbe went on, if bechlal, we need a reason, is because we are in this Shabbos, which is before Yud Beis Tammuz, and it's the most appropriate time for every single one of us to accept upon ourselves decisions and good hachlotas, good decisions of good inyanim, which we are each and every one of us is accepting upon us additional inyanim in honor of Yud Beis Tammuz. Because Yud Beis Tammuz really has a shaykhas to each and every Yid. As the Frierdiker Rebbe himself writes, that it wasn't something personal which happened to him. And he uses the expression, Koil asher b'shem Yisrael yechuneh. Anyone who can only be identified as a Yid has a shaykhas to the Geula of Yud Beis Tammuz. In other words, it includes everyone from a Gadol shebegdolim to a Pashat shebepshutim. How simple one may be, which this is the person whom we are referring to, by he merely is identified as a Yid. Koilan sheb'shem Yisrael yechuneh. Each and every one has a shaykhas to Yud Beis Tammuz. Therefore, when we're talking about inyanim of payil, inyanim of ma'aseh, the Rebbe always keeps on stressing the quotation, ha-ma'aseh hu ha'ikar, what counts most is ma'aseh, action. It is the most appropriate time at such a Farbrengen for everyone to accept upon himself inyanim, toivim, good hachlotes, good decisions, and good inyanim, which we are going to do in honor of Yud Beis Tammuz. And particularly when these decisions are done, not singly, but when we are all together in a tzibur, even Asaram Yisrael are considered a tzibur. And how much more so is it that each and every Yid is not one, each and every Yid himself consists of 10. Because there are the 10 koiches hanefesh within each and every one of us. So when we multiply each and every one's koiches hanefesh by all the people that are participant in the Farbrengen, so this is a tremendous chizuk, a tremendous source of strength for each and every one to be able to fulfill these good decisions which we will accept, being that these decisions were accepted not singularly, but they were accepted publicly. Though one does not know what the other one accepts, everyone is doing it in his thought and his mind, and it is not revealed to the person next to him what he's accepting upon him, but being that we're all in a position of accepting upon us additions, haysafis, in good inyanim, it is definite that the fact that it is done b'tzibur, it is done by public, definitely will bring to a greater assistance in fulfilling these inyanim. Based on what Chazal tell us, machshava toiva hakadosh baruch hu b'tzarfa l'maisa, which means that when one has a good thought, the Rebbe, that's the pashat attach of it, the Rebbe gives him credit as if he would do it. And Chassidus stresses a deeper inyan. Machshava taiva. Once a yid has a machshava taiva, a yid has a good thought to do something, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will see to it that it will be fulfilled. The Rebbe applied the expression of V'hu yechalkelecha, meaning, which is used in Chassidus, that the Rebbe will make up the keli, the Rebbe will make up the vessel. The same applies here. When we have these good decisions to do good things, and we accept these things in honor of Yud Beis Tammuz, HaKadosh Baruch Hu metzarf el ha'maisa, the Rebbe will see to it that it is added to a maisa and will be brought down into reality. This has been a geya Yud Beis Tammuz in general. How much more so is it when we look to find a particular hirah on this year's kviyas of Yud Beis Tammuz? This year Yud Beis Tammuz comes out on Thursday. Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz is Thursday and Friday. Afterwards, next Shabbos, we will read Parshas Pinchas. The Shabbos before Yud Beis Tammuz, we read Parshas Balak. What is the inyan that we can derive from the fact that Yud Beis Tammuz falls out on Thursday and Friday? Here we have the kviyas, where we are going right away from Yud Beis Tammuz, we are going into Shabbos. In other words, the great Yud Beis Tammuz is a great day, and when Yud Beis Tammuz should fall out in the middle of the week, and we have to get involved after our spiritual elevation of Yud Beis Tammuz, to get involved again in Inyanim Dechoil, of Uvden Dechoil, Inyanim of weekdays, Inyanim of Reshus Harabim, which is what weekday stands for, as opposed to Shabbos, which stands for Reshus HaYochet. It is not so geschmack, it is not that tasty. So when we have no alternative, we definitely do it. And we get involved again into the Reshus HaRabim, into the Uvden Dechoil, and we are mevara the nitzuzos, which we have to do in the Reshus HaRabim, in the weekdays. However, when we are in a position that from Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, we go right away into Shabbos. In other words, from one elevation we go into another elevation. Because the Shabbos after Yud Beis Tammuz, this is the Vayachulu HaShamayim Va'aretz, that is when all the days of the week are upgraded. So this is again another spiritual elevation. So this is a very, very special kind of kviyas, where from Yud Beis Tammuz we are going yet to a higher madrega, not getting involved in Inyanim of Uvden Dechoil, but involved only in Heilige Inyanim, and Shabbos Dik Inyanim, and Kedusha Dik Inyanim, Inyanim that are outright Kedusha. Not being involved in worldly inyanim and having to take these worldly inyanim and go through a stage of kol ma'asecha l'shem shamayim, or yet higher a stage of b'chol d'chachecha de'ayu. Here we are in a position where we're going straight from Yud Beis Tammuz right away into Shabbos. Therefore the Rebbe is requesting, and this he says is another reason for him Farbrengen today, in addition to the inyanim which were discussed previously, that the day of the Shabbos after Yud Beis Tammuz should be utilized accordingly all over, and that proper suitable chassidische Farbrengens should be made on the Shabbos after Yud Beis Tammuz, which will come as a continuation to the celebrating of Yud Beis Tammuz. So on the Shabbos after, the Rebbe is notifying now, because feeling that by notifying a week in advance it would give ample time all over to prepare and to see to it that on the Shabbos after Yud Beis Tammuz, appropriate and geschmackig Chassidische Farbrengen should take place in the continuation to Yud Beis Tammuz. I mentioned something. Mentioned it early in the Farbrengen and later in the Farbrengen as well. The difference between Golus and Geula, Golus and Geula really have the same lettering. There's one difference. Geula has an Aleph. Aleph reminds us on the Alufa Sheloilam, reminds us on the Rabbeinu Sheloilam. That is the whole difference between Golus and Geula. In Geula, the Aleph is seen. The Aleph, that was referring to the Rabbeinu Sheloilam, he's obvious, we see him and we feel him constantly. However, Golus, we're at a level of Seinu Lo Yirainu, as the pasuk says. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is hidden in Golus, and we do not see and we do not realize him out of every single move. However, how different is it when we're talking about Giyula? B'negei the Rambam, which, as the custom is in recent Farbrengens, that at every Farbrengen the Rebbe also explains an inyan in the Rambam, which comes out on this day's Kviyus. The Rebbe says they are those that, the Rebbe uses the expression, To'einaheim mevakshin, they are complaining, how is it that in a Shabbos dike Farbrengen, in a Chassidische Beis HaMedrash, and not stam in a Chassidische Beis HaMedrash, in this Beis HaMedrash where the Farbrengens are taking place, we get involved in explaining in Yonim and Nigla. Shabbos, we know, is Lashem, an Indian of learning Pnimiyas HaTorah. However, for one to get involved in learning Nigla, and not bypassing, but really getting involved in explaining an Indian and Nigla in Shabbos, this is something which Chassidim look at a little bit strange. The Rebbe says, first of all, we have to look into the Siddur. And when we look into the Siddur, we see that in the daily davening, as well as in the Shabbos Dike davening, and this became part of the Shabbos Dike davening we have in Yonim and Nigla, which we say every Shabbos, starting from the Baraisa, the Mishnah of Elu Dvarim Shein Lahem Shia, going on later to Ezel Mekayman, to the Baraisa of Rabbi Shmuel, of Shloishes and Midras HaTorah Nedreshes. So here we see, obviously, very openly, how we all go through saying in Yonim and Nigla, learning in Yonim and Nigla on Shabbos. However, it says, it's quoted from the Arizal, that the Arizal would learn on Shabbos 6 halakim of his learning would be in Pnimiyas HaTorah, and a seventh of his learning would be in Nigla the Torah, as opposed to his learning a whole week, which was the opposite. 6 halakim in Nigla the Torah, and a 7th was in Pnimiyas HaTorah. So we see, and being that it came down to us, that this is how the Arizal's Derech HaLimud was. That on Shabbos he would have 6/7 of his learning would be regarding Pnimiyas HaTorah. However, the inyan in the Rambam, which Rebbe says we're going to discuss today, is an inyan in the Rambam Take. However, it also has a shaykhus to Pnimiyas HaTorah. It has a shaykhus to Sisrei Torah. And the Rambam, Shir of today, discusses the halachas of Kiddushin. The Rambam says how one can be Mekadesh and Isha can be Mekudesh through Kesef, or through Shtar, or through Biyah. These are what the Mishnah tells us, the 3 categories. And the Rambam, when the Rambam refers to Kesef, the Rambam does not get involved in telling us in detail what kind of Kesef, but obviously, as we understand from the Rambam, it is any type of Kesef, as long as it has a value, the proper value, which is the value of a Shava Pruta from a Shava Pruta and up, and Isha becomes Mekudesh with this Kesef. In the Shulchan Aruch, we find a psak din from the Ramah, the Rebbe said it, if I recall correctly, in Simon Chav Zayin of Even Ezer, where the Ramah tells us that nowadays, when we're Mekadesh in Isha Bekesef, we are Mekadesh with a ring, with a tabas. In other words, we do not give her any giveaway of money, any gift of money, or any other type of valuables. But the custom today is to be Mekadesh Isha Bekesef. Bekesef with a tabas, with a ring, always with a ring. Right after this, the Beis Yosef does not mention it, however the Ramah is the one that says it. Right after this psak din, in quotations, it is brought that what is the source for this minig? The source for this minig is a Zohar. The Rebbe says it seems to him that the quotation for the source here is written by the Ramah himself. Though usually, when there's a source quoted right after a psak din of the Ramah and Shulchan Aruch, it is not the Ramah himself. Here it is different. Rabbi says perhaps it may be in another place or two in Dalet Chelki Shulchan Aruch that after the psak din of the Ramah, the source for his psak is written by the Ramah himself. So here we have that the inyan of being Mekadesh Isha with a ring as we do nowadays, the source of it is the Zohar. The emes the Rebbe says, that the Chinuch, the Sefer HaChinuch, also brings this, that the custom today is to be Mekadesh B'tabas, and he gives a reason why. The Ramah does not bring any reason. The Chinuch gives a reason. Chinuch's reason is as follows. Being that the woman is going to be wearing the ring constantly, so here we have a way to have a constant reminder that will constantly remind her of her obligations which came upon her through marriage. And there is no other thing which can be so outstanding, which can constantly remind her of all the obligations which she accepted upon herself, as the fact that she will be wearing a ring on her hand, this is something which she's always wearing. However, the question arises, why Take? Doesn't the Rambam bring this? The Chinuch gives a very good reason why the Kiddushin should be Alidei Tabas. The Ramah, who Paskin Sola Halacha, has the source of a Zohar. Why the Rambam says that Kiddushin are Bekesef, however the Rambam does not mention that the most ideal way to be Mekadesh Bekesef should be through giving the woman a Tabas. To explain this, the Rebbe says there is a Ragachova. The Ragachova, the Tzafnas Paneach, says a halacha and explains this halacha. If one is Mekadesh in Isha with a Sefer Torah that he possesses, the halacha is she is not Mekudesh. Why? The Ragachova explains, Kiddushin means that the Baal has to give something to the Isha without leaving, let me use his expression, any shiur, anything left over in this item's ownership to himself. In other words, it has to be something which is given away completely to the Isha. In a Sefer Torah, when one possesses a Sefer Torah, Ragacheva goes on, there are two inyanim. There's the physical ownership of the Sefer Torah. However, there's something a step further. He uses the expression, there's a spiritual thing here. There's a chaymer, which is the gashmias. Then there's a tzura. The fact that by him owning a Sefer Torah, or he had the Sefer Torah written for him, he was mekayim a mitzvah of ksiva Sefer Torah. With this mitzvah, he cannot part. This mitzvah remains with him. So when he's giving away the Sefer Torah to the Isha, he's not giving her something complete. He's giving and he's leaving over something for himself as well. What the spiritual thing which was acquired by writing or purchasing a Sefer Torah, this will always remain with him. This can never part from him. All that can part from him is the physical Sefer Torah. And therefore, this is a giving which does not part from him completely. This is a giving whereby he still remains with a part of this kinyan. Therefore, there's no Kiddush. Nowadays, we know that Eiresen and Nesuyin come together. Eiresen is the final step of engagement, but it's more than what we are used to as engagement. And as the Rambam himself writes, in the days of the Rambam, there was an Eiresen. Then a year would pass by, and as the Rambam explains, this would give the woman proper time to prepare herself for getting married, and then they would have the Nisuyin, which would be the final step of marriage. Today, when we have a chuppah, we combine both inyanim. The first half of the chuppah The first half of the chuppah is the eiresin, and the second half of the chuppah is the nisuyin. In fact, if we look into the Alter Rebbe Siddur, where the Alter Rebbe tells us the brachas which are recited today under a chuppah, the Alter Rebbe combined them. Birchas eiresin v'nisuyin. They come together. It's page 410. Furthermore, we will notice that there are two koisos by the chuppah. There's the first kois, this has a shaykhs to the eiresin. Then comes the second kois, this has a shaykhs to the nisuyin. So actually today what we are doing under a chuppah, we are really combining two inyanim, which Bizman HaGemara, or even Bizman HaRambam, were two complete separate ceremonies. In later generations, after the Rambam, the Rebbe says it seems, the days of the Beis Shmuel, who was a commentary on Shulchan Aruch of Ibn Ezra, it was already accepted that eiresin and nisuyin go together. We have another halacha. We have a halacha that when a husband gives something to his wife, or anything which belongs to his wife, which she has brought in, though this particular item is the kinyan, is the ownership of the housewife, however, the peiros, meaning the fruit which this item can bear, belongs to the husband. Nichse melug, popular expression in the Gemara. Now, if the woman would receive not a ring, if she would receive a value of money, immediately it becomes hers. However, this item can bring fruit-bearing item, can bring other finances, other monies. These other monies would belong not to the woman, would belong to whom? To the husband. So we're in a situation when the Baal is mekadesh the Isha, and he's giving her something which is going to be fruit-bearing. These peiros will automatically become his. So it's similar to the case of the Ragatshava where he's giving her a Sefer Torah. He's not giving her something which is going to be totally hers. He's giving her something which is taka hers. However, he is also going to have a shaykhs to the sinyan. So it's not a complete giveaway. It's a giveaway that possesses a shiur, something left over. Shin Yud Vav Reish. Something left over to the husband as well. Therefore, it is unpopular today to be mekadesh in such a format. The times of the Rambam, it was different. As the Rambam himself writes, first was eiresin. When the man gives something to his wife, at a period of eiresin, he has no shaykhs to the peiros. When does he begin getting a shaykhs of the peiros? Only after the nisuyin. And here 12 months will pass between the eiresin and the nisuyin. However, nowadays, when the eiresin and the nisuyin come together, he cannot give her anything or any type of item or anything which is going to be fruit-bearing. Because the fruits, the peiros, will belong to the husband. The Ramah says what he gives her is a tabas. We just mentioned the reason of the chinuch. However, we notice that when the husband, the chassan, gives the kala the tabas, he just doesn't give her the tabas, the ring, into her hand. He puts the ring on her finger, and that is when he expresses the harayat mikudeshesli. What is the reason for this? The Rebbe says, al pi halacha, when is a kela a kinyan? When the kela is used. Imagine the Baal would not give her a ring. He would give her any other type of item. Not money. Let's say he would give her a gift. When is the real final possession of this particular gift? Once this item is used. Therefore, when he gives her the ring, if the ring would be put into her hand, that is not the usage of a ring. Therefore, it will not be a complete kinyan of the Isha. Therefore, the Kedushin are not complete yet. However, when the husband puts the ring on her finger, this is the usage of a ring. A ring is made to be worn on a finger. So here the Isha is using the keli immediately as she's getting it. And therefore she's kind of the keli immediately. That is why the Kedushin is chal the moment he puts the ring on her finger and expresses the harayat mikudeshesli, that is when the Kedushin are chal. So here we understand why there was no need for the Rambam to bring or mention anything regarding Kiddushin al Yidei Tabas. However, nowadays, this is the most ideal item to be Mekadesh Isha al Yidei Tabas, and Taka, as the Minig Yisrael is, to not just give the Isha Tabas, but to take the Tabas and put it on her finger, which is the way, this is the usage of a Tabas. To conclude this inyan, Rabbi said, it is brought in Svarim that at Matan Torah there was the Eiresen between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Yidden. When Mashiach will come, it'll be the final marriage, the Nisuyin, between the Eibishter and Yidden. Being that we are talking now, that the custom nowadays is not to have time elapsing between the Eiresen and the Nisuyin, that means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to rush the Nisuyin, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to rush to the marriage between him and Yidden. So therefore the Rebbe has to rush to send us Mashiach, take us out of Golas. And the Rebbe again referred to the expression that Yidden are constantly screaming and crying in Golas, Ad Mosai, how much longer will we be in Golas? And the Rebbe should make it enter the Golas and bring together the Eres and the Nisuyin, which the Nisuyin in the spiritual sense means the complete level of marriage between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. B'negei the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which is customary that during the summer months the Rebbe learns a Mishnah of the Perek which we recite on that Shabbos. Today it is Perek Chamishi, the fifth Perek. In Perek Chamishi there is a Mishnah that tells us that there are four things that bring Golus to the world. And the Mishnah goes on telling us what are these four inyanim. Avodah Zarah, Gilu Aroyos, and Shvichas Damim. And the fourth one which the Mishnah counts is for not being careful in Shemitah. Where is it? It's Mishnah Tes. Golus Bala Olam. Golus comes into world al Avodah Zarah, al Gila Aroyes, al Shvichas Damim, al Shmitas Haaretz. Immediately the Rebbe stressed in the introduction, Mishnah uses the expression Golus Bala Olam. In other words, there are two separate inyanim. There's the world as the world stands in itself, and the world could be a beautiful world without Golus. However, through these four inyanim, this brings Golus into Olam. What are these four inyanim? If we take a look for a minute, three of them are the most famous averos that we know. But this we know that a person is not supposed to give his life for fulfilling a mitzvah or being given avera. However, when it comes to Gila Aroyes, Avodah Zarah, Shvichas Damim, if one is told that he's going to be killed unless he's over Avodah Zarah, or kill somebody, or is over on Gila Aroyes, he rather has to let himself be killed than to be over on any of these averos. Yehoreg va'al yaver. So these are the first three. The fourth is Shemitah. So if Shemitah is put into one category with these three, we can imagine that Shemitah is also a mitzvah which we have to be extremely careful in. We know, the Gemara tells us, that Pirkei Avos in general is Mila de Chasidus. In other words, whatever is discussed in Pirkei Avos is not in Yon in which we are required to do so al pi halacha. It's beyond the halachic requirement. Lifnim mishuras adin. This is what Pirkei Avos is all about. And incidentally, the Rebbe mentioned that is why, as an introduction to Pirkei Avos, we always stress Moshe Kibul Torah Mesinai. This comes to show us that even these inyanim which are merely ethical inyanim, or inyanim which we are not even mechuyev to do them al pi Torah, it's just lifnim mishuras adin that we have accepted to do so. Even these inyanim also have their originality, where their origin all from Sinai. Because by Yidden there is nothing from their own. It's not like by Umas Olam that certain ethical things were created by their own standards. By Yidden it is everything has its source from Sinai. But again, in Pirkei Avos, what is discussed? only in Yonim, as the Gemara uses the expression, Mila de Chasidusa. In Yonim, that are in Yonim of Chassidus, Lefnim Mishur Sadin. What does the Mishnah tell us here? You have to be careful. Golus Bala Yoilam, because of 4 Averas. What are these 4 Averas? 3 of them are known to be the most serious Averas in the Torah. This is not something which Pirkei Avos has to tell us. This is something which we know from obvious psukim all over the Torah. So Pirkei Avos comes, which is supposed to come and tell us in Yonim of Mila de Chasidusa. What does Pirkei Avos tell us? That we shouldn't din Avodah Zarah. Pirkei Avos tells us we shouldn't be Sheifach Dam, or not to be Eva Angila Aroyes, or Shmita, which is an open pasuk in the Torah. We're talking about only advices here which are additional on top of what we are Mekayim al Torah. And here we have a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that's telling us about such vital inyanim which are the Yesodus of Yiddishkeit. Therefore the Rebbe says we must learn that the Mishnah here is not telling us about the importance of that one shouldn't din Avodah Zarah. This is a pasuk. And everybody knows that for worshipping Avodah Zarah, he will be killed. And it's to the extent that Yehareg Val Yaver, one should let himself be killed and not be over on any one of these Averas. However, the Mishnah here is talking in a very refined way how one can be over on these Averas. In other words, in a much higher level. We're not talking about the Inyanim Kipshutai. We are talking about the Inyanim at a much higher Madregi. What is the meaning of Avodah Zarah in this sense? Doesn't mean idol worshipping. It means the feeling when a person comes to a conclusion that Kaichi ve'oitze miyadi asali esachayil hazeh. What brought to his success? It was not the bracha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it was his own intelligence and his own brain that has led to him being a success. This is a concept of Avodah Zarah. In other words, he does not believe that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu who guided him and gifted him, that he should be successful. He credits himself. And the Rebbe elaborated. When a person rises in the morning and he has to make certain telephone calls for his business, and he's before davening, before saying Haidul Hashem, or even before Maidani, but he knows that if he will not call that person, he knows that that person is going to leave his home or leave his office. And this is the only time when he can contact him. So he runs to the telephone and starts making one telephone and another second telephone and a third telephone to chaparayim these contacts which, according to his thinking, he will not be able to make during the day. Would he believe that everything is dependent on the Reibishter? Then he knows that the first thing in the morning he has to do is go to daven. From Beis HaKnesses he has to go to Beis HaMedrash. And then is when he can go to Bechol D'Rachecha D'Eyu. That is when he can go and get involved in his business. And then whatever he does throughout the day, definitely he has to guide himself and prepare a proper schedule that he should be able to operate on a successful day. Rabbi says, the telephone at this morning hour is not made for the use of business. The telephone at this morning hour is that he should go and call another Yid, that another Yid should also come to Minyan. And another Yid should also come to Shul and to learn. Just like the Chazal, the Medrash tells us regarding gold. The Medrash says that the only reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu created gold was that gold should be able to be used for the Beis HaMikdash. Once we have gold, gold could be used for other things already too, and can be used for the wrong things already. The same has been again the telephone. The telephone was made that at that time of the hour, that hour of the day, should be made to call another Yid and remind him to go to Shul or remind him to go to a Kviyas. However, unfortunately, there are people that can use the telephone at that time for different inyan. And this is what the Mishnah means by Avodah Zarah. It doesn't mean literally worshipping to idols. First of all, the Gemara tells us that the concept of Avodah Zarah was basically abolished already. But here we are talking about Avodah Zarah in a completely different level. And this is what Pirkei Avos is referring. That a person has to be careful even at such a level in Avodah Zarah. The same is when we're going a step further. Gilu Aroyis. Gila Aroyes here does not mean Gila Aroyes Kipshutai. It means in the sense how a person has to be extremely careful. Gemara tells us that a Yid has to be careful where he looks and what he looks at. And it has a tremendous impact on the person. Going to such an extent that there's a halach in Shulchan Aruch, koil be'isha erva, that a man is not allowed to hear a woman singing. Rebbe says, now a question will arise. True, he's not allowed to hear her singing when she's around. How would it be if he's allowed to hear a woman singing on a record? She's not in front of him, not in her presence, but he's just listening to her voice. Is this permitted to Al Pi Shulchan Aruch, or is this prohibited? The Rebbe says, this question is discussed in contemporary Svarim, where they raise these type of issues. But one thing we can be sure about, that no one will gain Yireh Shamayim if he will listen to these type of records. So this is the type of Gilu Arayos which the Mishnah here is referring to. In other words, in a higher, it doesn't mean Chas v'Shalom Kipshutai, it means in such type of a thing. While mentioning a record, the Rebbe says the same type of question would require the month of Elul, would apply to the month of Elul. The month of Elul, we know we listen to the Shofar daily. How about listening to the Shofar not from a person who blows the Shofar, but listening to a Shofar from a record? Or reading the Megillah through a record or through a telephone. So here the Rebbe says, the idea of Shofar is to awaken the person, as the Pasuk says, Hayitoka Shofar be'ir va'am lo yichodu. What is the whole goal of Shofar? To awaken us spiritually. This can only be accomplished when we hear it from a human being who's taka doing it b'shas ma'aseh. To hear the voice of a shofar on a record will not produce what the shofar has to accomplish. To hayitoka shofar be'ir v'am lo yichodu. This is something which at many occasions the Rebbe refers to this. The Rebbe's opinion in halacha is that the voice of a person over a phone or over radio, when it's transmitted through something, is not the same voice of the person any longer. And the same shaila would be negeya lahalacha. The Rebbe brings the same question, but negeya a get. If a husband gives authority for the get, and he's expressing this authority through the telephone. The shitta of the Rebbe is that we cannot honor such an authority when it comes over the telephone, because it is already not the voice of the husband of the Adam HaMegarish. And the same would apply to any other type of inyan where we have to, reading the Megillah or Havdalah or any type of thing where we have to hear the voice of the person. If the voice is expressed not live, but through a telephone, through a radio, through a cassette or a record, we are not yotzeh this particular inyan. Then we come to the fourth category, to shvichas damim, shedding of blood. Third, thank you. Naturally, the Mishnah here does not refer to the fact of killing somebody. This is something which the Torah tells us we're not allowed to. Here we are talking in a much dakasdiker level. Here we are talking, Gemara tells us, hamal bim pnei chaveiroi. If one embarrasses somebody, he is considered a shayfech dam, as he has shedded his blood. The Rebbe says, one may think to himself, we know there's a mitzvah of a chayech techiyach ha'misecha. We have to criticize somebody. If we see someone doing something wrong, he has to be criticized. Especially based on the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael. So he expresses love to his fellow Jew, and he doesn't want to see him sin. So he will go ahead and criticize the person when he sees him doing something wrong. However, he will not think twice what expression is he using while he's criticizing him. What are the words that he's using when he's trying to criticize the person and bring him to better? Is he using the proper wording? Or perhaps at the same time what he's doing, he's malbim pnei chaveiro, he's shedding his blood. He's making him turn colors, which this is the idea of shvichos damim. It's the same idea. So this is what the Mishnah tells us here. That avodah zarah, gila aroyos, and shvichas damim. Mishnah here is not talking in the Gashmiistic sense of Avodah Zarah, Gila Rois Shvichas Damim. The Mishnah is talking in a complete, refined level. However, it still remains to be Avodah Zarah, Gila Rois Shvichas Damim. Regarding Shemitah, Rabbi Teich, usually we know that Shemitah is an inyan which applies to Eretz Yisrael. So the Mishnah here tells us that we have to be very careful in all the details of Shemitah, even in Chutz La'aretz at times, especially nowadays that Eretz Yisrael ships out a lot of fruit. There are a lot of wine from Eretz Yisrael which is sent all over the world, or even esroigim. So we have to be very careful when we come across fruit of Eretz Yisrael or wine of Eretz Yisrael to make sure that this is not from Shemitah. So this is what the Mishnah is telling us regarding all these inyanim. And here we see something which requires to be mentioned. There are 613 mitzvahs. For 609 of them, it does not lead to Golus. It is only these 4. In other words, when we say in davening, it is our sins that have driven us out of our land and put us into Golus. What do we really mean by our sins? It is, had the Yidden observed all of these 4 mitzvahs perfectly and not be careful in the remainder 609 of them, then it wouldn't have came to Golus. It is only that these 4 inyanim, this is what Golus Baal Olam. This is what introduces the concept of Golus into Olam. And the Rebbe concluded this inyan with a quotation from the Frierdiker Rebbe. Frierdiker Rebbe said that we are at a time when we are ready, all ready to get out of Golus and to greet Mashiach. All that we are missing is that we have to polish our buttons. In other words, a soldier who's a soldier in the army, the buttons of his uniform also have to be shiny. So we are ready wearing our uniforms. We have our buttons on our uniforms. All that's lacking is the final touch-up. And the final touch-up, that's expressed in the fact that shining our buttons. Rabbi explained, a jacket in itself which has the buttons is a lavush. In other words, it is not something which is part of the person, it is something additional on the person. A beged, a malbush which the person is wearing. And when we're talking about buttons, buttons in their own rights really have no value. When does a button have a value? When the button is on the jacket. And in order that the jacket should give the proper appearance, that is when buttons are used. So we are already at the level where we're wearing our jackets, we have the proper, in other words, the levushim, everything is ready. All that we need is the final touch, which means the final touch of shining our buttons. And once we will shine our buttons, we will go through the final touch. This will take us totally out of Golus and bring us into an Olam, which is a beautiful and gloriful Olam, which is an Olam full of Getlachkeit, full of godliness, without Golus, but we will be brought into Geula, which as mentioned earlier, Geula is the same lettering as Golus. But all we do is we add an Aleph. And the Aleph stands for the Aluf Mishalaylam, for the Rabbeinu Shalaylam. Benegeya the Rashi in this week's Sedre, Rebbe says there are psukim in Parshas Balak which are discussed in the Rambam, in the Sefer Halachos of the Rambam. Though we know that the Rambam himself tells us that his Sefer is a Sefer, the Yad HaChazaka, is a Sefer of Halachos. However, at the end of the Rambam, the last 2 prokim of Hilchis Melachim Memulchamei Seyin, we find that the Rambam quotes there psukim of this week's Seder of Parshas Balak, and the Rambam teaches us these psukim. The Rebbe says it was already discussed in previous occasions. In some parts of the psukim, the Rambam teaches like Rashi. Other parts of the psukim, the Rambam teaches different. Beginning from the pasuk after Shvi, Kapitel Chav Dalet, pasuk Yud Zayin. Pasuk says, Erenu v'loi ata, Ashurenu v'loi karayv. So the Rambam begins explaining that these psukim have a shaykhis to the days of the Malchus Beis David, the kingdom of David HaMelech, and concludes that the latter part of these psukim have a shaykhis to the days of Mashiach. This pasuk Yud Zayin, concludes with the words, V'karka kol b'nei sheis. V'karka, as Rashi teaches, means he will destroy kol b'nei sheis. Whom do we refer to by b'nei sheis? Let us look into Rashi. B'nei sheis, kol ha'umis. It refers to all the nations. Shekulam yotzu min sheis. They are all descendants of sheis. Who was sheis? So Rashi says, perhaps the child who was learning Chumash, it's already more than a half a year since we learned Bereshis. So Rashi is reminding us who sheis was. Sheis was b'noi shel Adam Harishon, the son of Adam Harishon. So how do we refer to all the goyim here? B'nei sheis. If we go through Chumash, we go through Navi, we do not find an expression referring to the world, to the Ummah Sa'elam, as the children of Sheis. Very, very strange. True, they are the children of Sheis, but it's a very rare expression to use B'nai Sheis. Actually, the pasuk could take any one of the names until Noach, as well as Noach, because all the nations are descendants of all the people that lived until Noach. But we see the pasuk doesn't do so. And for whatever reason, the pasuk has selected to refer to the people of the universe, the people of all the nations, by what title? By the title, Children of Sheis. There's a pasuk in this week's Seder, Loi, remember? Ben Adam. Li ishkel v'yinochem. It's also on these psukim. Okay. Yeah, there's a pasuk in Chav Gimel pasuk Yites. Lo ishkel v'yechazev uven Adam v'yisnochem. So in Pashtus we see Ben Adam refers to a person. Every person is a Ben Adam, everyone is a Ben of Adam Arishon. Rebbe mentioned there's a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi teaches that the pasuk here, pasuk Yutes, Lo ishkel v'yechazev uben Adam v'yisnochem, refers to Moshe Rabbeinu. That Moshe Rabbeinu was considered a ishkel, he was considered a Ben Adam. However, when we learn Pashat Pshat, we don't learn it like the Yerushalmi. We learn that who is Ben Adam? Ben Adam are people. There are many expressions in Tilim. B'nei Adam. Whom do we mean by B'nei Adam? B'nei Adam means people. Here we see that the pasuk does not refer to B'nei Adam, not B'nei Noach, or not B'nei Enosh, who was Sheis' son. But what does the pasuk refer to? Dafke B'nei Sheis. And Rashi does not give any type of explanation why Take Kolo Umois are considered B'nei Sheis. The Rebbe explained, we have an expression, famous expression, there is an Even Shesiya. There was a spot in the area of the Beis HaMikdash, an Even Shesiya. What is the type of Even Shesiya? So the Gemara tells us, Shemimenu Hushtas Kol Ha'olam. This is a source of water which the whole world drank from this water. What do we derive from this? Is the taich of sheis. Sheis, having a shaykhs to the same concept as shesiya, even shesiya. Shesiya meaning a source. Something which is general, klolistic, and has a shaykhs to the entire world. That is why, would the pasuk use the expression Ben Adam? Would the pasuk use any other expression historically referring to anyone else that lived in the generations until Noach, or even Noach? We will not have the thought of sheis in a sense of completeness. Here the pasuk wants to say the karka kol b'nei sheis, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to make a hole, drill a hole through, which means destroy. Kol b'nei sheis. So Memela, the pasuk finds it appropriate here to use the expression of sheis, because sheis brings out the concept how hushtas kol ha'olam, it expresses a unity of the entire world. As we do not find this in any one of the other names between Adam and Noach. And that is why everything is extremely accurate. And the pasuk here, chapt on, selected to use the expression of b'nei sheis rather than to use any other one of those other people that lived in those generations, because sheis not just historically refers to Sheis, the son of Adam Arishon, it also brings out an idea, Sheis Meloshen Shesiya. It's a general concept of the entire existence of the world. As Rashi himself says, Kala Umais. And the Kala Umais are reflected at most in the expression of Sheis. It's dawned on me. When the Rebbe was talking the greatness of the fact that from Yud Beis Tammuz we are going to be entering straight into Shabbos. He stressed that Shabbos is a day that unites all the Yidden. And referring to what we constantly keep on stressing, Avas Yisrael and Achdus Yisrael, unity of all of Klal Yisrael, in Shabbos we find a halacha that in times when Yidden had to be mafresh, had to take away truma and meiser and everything off their fruits. So an Am Ha'aretz would not be believed as far as to say that these fruits, meiser and truma, were taken off these fruits. The Yerushalmi tells us on Shabbos there's an exception. That on Shabbos, even an Am Ha'aretz we would also believe him, because even an Am Ha'aretz does not lie on Shabbos. What do we derive from this? From here we derive that Shabbos is a day that brings together all of Klal Yisrael. In other words, one who during the week we do not have any trust in him. On Shabbos we give him trust. Shows us that this is the day that is ma'ached, that unites all of Klal Yisrael, and therefore when we go from Yud Beis Tammuz into the day of Shabbos, it is a very special day. Going straight from Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, which will be Thursday and Friday, and we go straight from that into Shabbos, which Shabbos is a day which expresses a total unity amongst Klal Yisrael. Throughout the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred again very strong to the takana, to the ruling of not drinking too much mashke. And Rebbe said there are really no excuses for it, and everything should be in the same limitation and limitations which were once instituted, and this is something which has to stay that way. Rebbe says that there are really no excuses which can be accepted. He says it's the obligation of the mashpiyim and the mashgichim in the yeshivas that if they were appointed to be mashpiyim and mashgichim, it is their duty to carry this out and to see to it that this be fulfilled. The Rebbe referred to an incident where he received correspondence from mashpiyim and mashgichim of a yeshiva right after given Yontef, that they were not able to control their students throughout the Yontef, and therefore they wrote this letter to the Rebbe. The Rebbe says what they did was, right away on Mitzvah Yontef, they sent a letter to 770. The Rebbe says this is not what they are mashpiyim and mashgichim for, to send letters after Yontef to 770, saying that they were not able to control their local situation. If al pi hashgacha pratis, they were appointed to be mashpiyim and mashgichim in a yeshiva, this is a sign or maila that they were given koiches to utilize their hashpah and see to it that it should not come to these type of inyanim. And therefore, again, the Rebbe urged that there are really no excuses, and one should not talk himself in that by drinking more mashke, this is an expression of Hasidus, that this is he's going to accomplish something by doing that. It is definitely not so. If it is against the will of the Rabbeim, nothing positive can be accomplished when it is done against the will of the Rabbeim. I can trouble someone for a Rambam. noshim. It says we are used to all types of diyukim in the Rambam. And custom is that every word of the Rambam we make complete pilpulim on it, and what did the Rambam mean by this, what did the Rambam mean by that, and everything written by the Rambam is extremely accurate. The opening to Seder Noshim, the Rambam quotes a pasuk: Teiras Chacham Moker Chayim Losu Mimoikshei Moves. And we really did not think, what shayches does it have to the Seder Noshim? Teiras Chacham is the source of life, to take away from one being tripped with death. The Rebbe said, the explanation of this would be very obvious. Chazal tell us that when one succeeds with his wife, it is a success. It is a blessed success. Chas v'sholom different. It's mar mimoves. It is bitter. It is worse than chas v'sholom than death. And that is why the Rambam found it appropriate to quote this pasuk here. Rambam means that by fulfilling and adhering to the Seder Noshim, to what's written here in these halachas, by doing so, one will accomplish losur, this will get away, meikshe moves, in yanim that lead to chas v'sholom to moves. So therefore, it is most suitable to use these words as an opening to Hilchas Ishos, because by fulfilling all the details of Hilchas Ishos, this will lead to losur and meikshe moves. It was then in the Farbrengen, Rabbi said, if many Farbrengens, we conclude the Farbrengen with the singing of Sheyibana Beis HaMikdash, it is extremely appropriate in today's Farbrengen, because today in Perik Hamishi we have the Mishnah of Sheyibana Beis HaMikdash. A good tavach.